With Zinshiki sleeping on his couch, Mavere hadn't spent the night, promising instead that she'd meet Desi after dinner and talk with her about the whole situation. It seemed like a good idea, and if Miv was taking on the role of the woman of the house, so be it. He'd nearly had a stroke when he'd come home and found Zinshiki leaping about to the sound of screaming bagpipes and yowling out the March of Cambreath. The very, very prohibited March of Cambreath. Dealing with Desi after that fiasco would just have been too much. At least Miv called him before bed, and apparently things went better than he would have hoped for. With a human girl, a new sister would have been a major event and possibly major drama. Given Shilvanti norms of extended family, Desi accepted the whole notion readily enough, though she'd balked a bit at learning her new sister wasn't another Shilvanti. Hopefully talking with Miv had answered her concerns. Putting off the talk with Desi hadn't been ideal, but at least there was a situation now. Until late the day before, the whole agenda for enrolling Zinshiki was up in the air. The head registrar threw three kinds of hysterics, leaving Tom to wonder if she might be related to Berdine. But the deed was done. Zinshiki was enrolled. The rest was in the details. That morning he'd woken and carefully listened at his bedroom door. After a very long, very earnest conversation about digging into his files, they'd agreed on the arrangements the night before. True to her word, Zinshiki had been up and dressed in some sort of sleeveless robe that was ornately patterned in black and scarlet. He'd never seen anything quite like it, and put it down to Pezin attire. She slipped into the bathroom to dress before he could ask while he fixed breakfast, and changed his password. As a first breakfast, he still wasn't sure what a Pezin could eat. There was an appointment with the campus doctor later on in the week to see if anything human might be poisonous. While Pezin seemed to be on the generous side of omnivorous, it didn't hurt to be careful, and he kept it simple, with bacon, eggs, and toast. Zinshiki had eaten it all with a slow deliberation, though the bacon had gone down first, and she'd eyed his plate after the fact. Zinshiki had been quiet all morning, and given how poorly things had gone for her at Soche, he didn't press. Family seemed as important to Pezin as they were to Shilvanti, though he had no idea how. It was one more thing that would sort itself out. Hopefully. After arriving at class, Tom hunkered down at his desk, and poked for his bag and waited for the Miv and the other girls to arrive. Zinshiki was already sitting down in the first row, which would put her next to Desi and Melondi, with Nespa just behind her. It was a lot to think about. He knew what he was getting into, at least for a value of knowing that seemed like the shallow end of the pool. Mavere seemed curiously more at ease. What Zinshiki thought was anyone's guess. That only left Desi and the girls, and somewhere down the line, a follow-on conversation with Agent Davari. Joy. At least once he figured out how the girls were going to get along, he'd have something reasonable to say. Zinshiki's introduction with Shilvanti at Soche had gone badly, and he desperately hoped that the girls would do better. The academy was for young nobles, but they'd embraced Desi after the fact. Hopefully this would go reasonably well. Tom glanced up when the door opened, and Belder piled inside, followed by the twins and Jaxmi. Belder looked at Zinshiki curiously, but gave her a wave, while the twins canted their heads to the side for an instant before approaching his desk. Several other girls came in, but the twins perched there and blocked his view. "Good morning, Professor," the girls caroled in stereo, beaming at him like twin cats that had eaten a tree full of canaries. They were back to looking identical. Desi would probably have talked to the others at breakfast, and Tom wondered if it was down to the speed of news. "Welcome back." "Good morning, ladies." Tom gave them a smile. It was good to be back home, and while he'd hoped to get the reactions from the rest of the class to Zinshiki sitting there, it was not to be. At least not without gawking, obviously. In the meantime, the twins' welcome was gratifying. "How can I help you, ladies?" "Sir, we need to ask you a favour," started the sister on the left. The first one out was usually Kamara, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. "We ran out of movies for Shell," her sister carried on, and they looked at each other, invisibly conferring. "We'd love to get some more of the action movies," said Left, while Right nodded and looked a bit doleful. "But we need to ask for something for Aku." Fine. Kazan had been more attached to Aku, though according to the boy, both sisters had been perfect ladies about it. That put Kamara on the left and Kazan on the right. Probably. "He hasn't been himself since going on tour, and we were starting to worry." Right nodded. "Worry a lot." "Okay, so action movies for you and something for him? I think I can handle that," he replied, nodding amiably. He'd been awake for at least an extra hour, thinking of the contraband he had stashed away, but the movies were safe. In the years after the landing, the interior had blacklisted any song embraced by the rebels. He'd been sure to get recordings of them all, just on principle at first, but after Gimme Shelter and Tom Petty's Southern Accents album made the list, it had become personal. Getting millennials and Generation Alpha worked up over the Stones? The Shilvanti might as well have banned George Gershwin, but he'd kept his collection safe all the same. Somehow movies had never been a problem, though. The interior went after the music that the rebellion had, however quietly, called its own, but films where humans blew up other humans, or robots, or any aliens that didn't look like Shilvanti, were all perfectly fine. So the flags and old soldiers faded away while Independence Day became the Festival of Colours. And as life went on, the rebellion gradually died. Tom cocked his head to one side. "Any word on how he's doing with the tour?" Both girls frowned slightly, shaking their heads, and probably Kaslin almost grimaced. He was about to ask more when he saw Mavere come into the room, and he nodded briefly. "Get with me next class. I'll bring a file." "Oh, you don't have to worry, sir." Probably Kamara perked up, nudging her sister. "We mean, if you're busy." Oh, that's right, sir." Probably Kaslin started nodding vigorously. "Before the end of the week would be great." "Sure." It was nice to be back, and he watched the twins making their retreat quickly. It was nice to be missed, but he hadn't been gone that long. All the same, he jotted down a note to himself on his omnipad, and gave Miv a smile that he tried to keep reserved. It wasn't that hard. After picking for a very careful conversation about privacy with Ziki, then the conversation with Miv about Desi, he still had no idea what to do with the class. Professor Bora had trashed his material on the First World War. There would need to be some time spent correcting things, at least shaping the ghastly message she'd given the girls, but that still left him a problem. He'd just have to wing it. First things first, though. Miv was settling in at her desk, and Tom snuck a look up at the girls. They'd arranged themselves in their usual seats, and most eyes were on him. That was, well, not what he'd expected. Honestly, he'd been afraid of staring or even overt hostility towards Ziki, and while there were a few looks her way, he hadn't felt this much like the centre of attention since the first day of class. Weird. Not bad, but weird. He looked over as Mavere took to the lectern and nodded graciously to the class. He always stood a bit in awe of her style, feeling like he rambled. Mavere had poise, and it showed during every lecture. "Good morning." Miv looked over the girls and smiled, as if she was about to let them all in on a secret. "I'd like to start today by welcoming the newest student to our class, Miss Ziki." She said it right, too. Miv's portion of the lesson covered one of the last and bloodiest of the Wars of Consolidation, that awful period of conflicts before the final unification of Shill into a global imperium. The wars had been waged across Shill at a time when their technology was roughly that of the 1930s. They were a lousy comparison to World War I, but they made a perfect contrast. They were also a distant memory. The plan had been to raise the spectre of the war and make it a reality. Peter Jackson had completed his work on They Shall Not Grow Old right before the Shilvanti had landed, and he'd brought a copy when they left Earth. It was just the thing. Sad, sweet, brave, and devastating. It was a testament to a war fought for nothing that had taken everything. It wasn't pointless to show it, but it was pointless to show it now. Things had been botched up, moved around and misrepresented, and he needed to get things back in context before it would have any impact. He tried focusing on the problem all through Miv's talk and come up with very little. The picture only made it worse. The plan had been to start this lecture with a photograph of No Man's Land, as a preamble to what the next 2 weeks would bring. There on the screen, in glorious black and white, shattered trees stood shattered and broken out to the horizon over mounds of churned mud and torn earth. A small caption at the bottom read, "No Man's Land. Once a forest in Flanders fields." He'd known this moment was coming ever since he prepared the lesson. He thought he prepared himself for the emotional gut punch. He was wrong. The day the Shorvanti landed, he was sitting in his study, poking at something on his PC. The world went white and the windows shattered. There was no telling how long he'd been unconscious, but when he woke up, there was only smoke, and he collected himself enough to go upstairs. The view across to Fort Ben Harrison would be better up there. All that had met his eyes was dust and smoke and ruin. The world had been leached of colour, turned into black and white, as he stood there, numb, wondering what had happened, wondering where his family was. The view was the same. Nothing but devastation, as far as the eye could see. Across the lake and reaching off to the distance, there wasn't a sign of life. He'd had something to say, at least before Barai had bugged things up. Now? His mouth was dry as he stood facing the screen, and he ran his tongue over his teeth, his mind drawn back to where all this began. Say something, man. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Miv stir, and he glanced over briefly. There was a look of agonized concern on her face. He'd seen it before, when they put together this lesson. He'd cried his eyes out that night after closing the stateroom door, but he thought he'd be ready when the time came. Say anything. Though I saw it all around, never thought that I could be affected, he whispered, then coughed. It wasn't Flanders Fields, but even the poem would be void of context for now. But the song did, and his voice grew steady, his mind latching onto the lyrics like a lifeline. Thought that we'd be the last to go. It is so strange the way things turn. He still stood staring at the picture, writ large as the world on the giant wall screen, feeling like it was ready to fall over him, but he reached out and gripped the side of the lectern and kept going. And drove the night toward my home, the place that I was born on the lakeside. As daylight broke, I saw the earth. The trees had burned down to the ground. There were tears there at the corner of his eyes, but he was too numb to cry, and he squeezed his eyes shut. They beaded on his cheeks, but didn't flow. He kept his eyes closed and stayed facing the screen. The light of the projection washed over him, but he didn't turn, didn't let them see. The human year 1914 marked the end of things. It was a mockery of the wars of consolidation. It mocked many 1,000 widows out of their dear husbands, mocked mothers from their sons, mocked castles down. Note to self, let Melondi watch Henry V, and keep rolling. Humans thought it would be the war to end all wars, but unlike the wars of consolidation, our war tore apart empires, tore down the social order, tore down the world. Tom swallowed and searched for some sort of context, something to ground all this and give it meaning. When we started this class, we began with the start of humanity's industrial age. I taught you about the American Civil War. Well, I cleaned that up a good bit for you. He turned around and looked up at the girls, who were looking at him. On the pads would be transcribing his words into notes, letting them listen. Heads canted. Desi was looking at him with concern filling her eyes. He pressed on. I did that because I have wanted to impress upon you the best that humanity can be. And given how Kellark's friend reacted to one of the movies I lent you, I felt justified. At least, until this week. Hearing how Professor Borai misrepresented everything I wanted you to learn about this conflict, I see I can't do that. That was good. What was the remark? Yes. The American Civil War was the crossroads of change for North America, as it made a profound change on the United States, with events influencing both Canada and Mexico. I said you could not understand the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries without understanding the vast calamity that happened in the 19th. Now, I am telling you that you cannot understand anything of Earth without understanding the calamity that unfolded in 1914. It all began with a single gunshot, a single death. The situation with the Alliance and the Consortium sucks right now. Note to self, keep an eye on Malondi. World War I was a family feud. Don't let this get too personal. I had planned on going into depth on these next few years over the next couple of weeks. Professor Borai has fucked things royally, given me reasons to alter the lesson. Tom looked at the girls, who were looking back with concern, confusion, and consternation. Borai had done a number on their grades, and while Ganya had shown her the door, she wasn't going to overturn the whole exchange program. He'd heard about the whole fiasco from Miv, of course, but seeing the looks on the girls' faces brought it home. He blinked for a moment as an old memory resurfaced. Was it a good idea? It had been a fun class in grade school. He could wing it. The only girl not involved in chess club was Desala, but he'd make it work. I also understand that her time here was contentious, and she failed you on this material. Consequently, I will be teaching you about something else. Instead of the planned lessons, we will be discussing the Lost Generation. Also, I'm cancelling chess club. In its place, we'll be doing an exercise. Teams of 1 or 2 will be taking a nation, each. On one side, 7 of you will represent the powers of Britain, France, Russia, Japan, and the United States. On the other side, 6 of you will represent Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Tom looked around at the girls, already making notes in his mind on who would be best for who. The twins would have to be Italy. Over the next 2 weeks, this activity will be worth 200 points of extra credit to the winning team. The losers will get none. That got them. The girl sat upright, looking eager. Not exactly 50 points to Gryffindor, but close enough. Now I just have to remember how it worked. It's not like I have anything else going on. Letsy waited around until the last of the girls came out. The Kerbal twins were in perfect lockstep again. It felt like everything was unsettled, though it couldn't be pinned on the new girl. She still wasn't sure what was going on with the Pezin, but Desi would probably know more soon. At any rate, Ziki had left first and disappeared. There was time to figure her out later, and she shouldered her bag as everyone stood about looking at Desi. Don't ask. I don't know any more about her than what I told you over breakfast. Desi shrugged, and leaned back against the wall. Where did she go, anyway? She left pretty fast. Lark nodded up the corridor toward the exit. I think she might be nervous. Desi bit her lip following Lark's glance. Professor Pelavon said she had it pretty rough at her last school. Anyway, I appreciate all of you letting her study with us. And she's a noble, too, Desala muttered. Desala, come on. Letsy rolled her eyes and sighed in exasperation. I'm not complaining. It's not like those two didn't have us all fooled. She lolled her head over to nod pointedly at Desi and Melondi. "I've met enough nobles who didn't deserve to be, and now I guess I've met at least a few who aren't that do deserve it. I just like knowing who we're dealing with." Desi glowered back, but Leslie had to concede the point. Sala's family had made their fortunes as one of the leading security firms on Shill, and if she was just being cautious, well, it was progress. It seemed like a good idea to change the subject, though. "What do you think about class? I mean, he scrapped the readings, pushed back the video, and now we have that exercise. That Civil War week gave me nightmares for days." Pris hunched her shoulders and shuddered. "Weeks," Sefir nodded, which caused more than a few nods of agreement. Sefir might look like a poster girl for the Marines, but it was the last thing she wanted. "The IOTC and MOTC girls would probably have eaten it up and come back for more, but Bree had come at the material cold and we all saw how that went." Belda cocked her head and looked back towards the classroom. "Do we want to ask him for details?" "What? For the extra nightmares?" Nespa shook her head firmly. "If he went easy on us with the first one, no thank you." "You saw the look on his face. I mean, you have to wonder what it's like growing up with one big war after another, all right there on your planet. It's amazing he's as normal as he is. I mean, for a man," Melondi said, sounding not entirely convinced. "It's kind of hard to imagine all those empires falling apart, instead of coming together like the wars of consolidation. They were so long ago, it's hard to imagine." "I don't know any men that would be that normal. I mean, Shorvanti guys our age would be a mess." Desi shook her head like she was clearing her head, and glanced over at Mel. "Are you alright?" "You don't know any Shorvanti guys. Mara and Lynn have dibs on Aku." Mel grinned and elbowed Desi, before looking around at the others. "Anyway, I am, really. It just feels a little close to home, you know. Aku's like a brother to us." Despite the denial, the Kerbal sisters were looking pleased all the same, and the second one nodded along with the first. "Besides, all the extra credit will fix everything." "Yeah." Desi shoved herself away from the wall. "I'd better go catch up with Zenshiki. See you all later for the wedding meeting? Professor Pelavon told me what she needs for the wedding tomorrow. I'm going to ask if she wants to join us." "You think she might?" Letzi watched as Melondi shouldered her tote bag, following along as the girls started splitting up. It was lunchtime, but a couple of them had an afternoon class. At least they all knew to meet that evening for the plan. It was funny how the world had changed. Desala wasn't so difficult these days, but there were times it was good to help her get some distance from the others. The wedding meeting would be fun, though, and that would be a relief. "Well, I can take her to the library with me," Desi said, bowing her head slightly in thought. "She's going to be my sister. I really ought to try." Melondi nodded. "I'll come along if you want." Letzi watched the pair as they went up the hallway. In a few moments the place was empty, save for her and Desala, who watched an eyebrow thoughtfully. "All right, Desala, you might as well say it." Letzi kept herself from sighing. Sometimes it wasn't easy. "I'm just curious where all this is going." Desala shrugged, looking like the picture of innocence. Letzi had seen that look before and she wasn't buying it. For a wonder, Desala nodded to herself and kept talking. "You know the difference between the rest of you and me? I don't trust people as easily." Letzi pursed her lips, trying to keep the sarcasm at bay. It wasn't like Sala opened up very often. Even so. "That isn't exactly news, you know. What's really on your mind?" Desala rolled her eyes slightly, the way she'd done when they were getting to know one another, and she'd been the big girl on campus. "This isn't our pre-academy days, you know. Everyone has agendas. It's just that you didn't get to see them the way I did when I was growing up. Back then, everyone had their private schools, and now we're all in one great big happy academy. But you've seen it. The house pins start coming out. People group up in their clubs. Just look at the IOTC girls. They may be the worst, but they're a perfect example. Okay. Lexi shrugged but conceded the point, and she fell into step as they made their way back out of the hall. What are you getting at, though? Even though we all have our own distinct agendas, they all make sense. House agendas, personal agendas, career agendas. I can get it. Desala pushed open the door, and they stepped out into the cold fall air. Who knows what hers is? Well, at least Desi said she doesn't need to eat anyone. Vadim stepped inside the front room for Tandri's sister's carpentry. The shop was devoid of the sound of work that filled the interior when he'd been here last, but wood dust lingered in the air, tickling his nose, and he sniffed demurely. Hello? Most boys wouldn't be caught dead alone in a place like this, and the goddess knew his first time here had given him doubts, but he was committed now. Besides, they were tradeswomen. They'd done a good job on the restaurant, and if this part of town was a little outside his lane, it still seemed safe. During the day, at least. Hey there! A woman poked her head out from the back room, wiping her hand on her coveralls, grinning openly. Be right with you. Vadim knew any number of guys who would have run for the exit, but you met all kinds in a restaurant. You just had to be resilient. Anyway, she was old enough to be his aunt, and despite any misgivings, he made his way over to the counter. Thank you, ma'am. I had the message from Miss Alara that my order was ready. Vadim glanced at her name tag as he got closer. Yendel. I'm surprised you're open, Miss Yendel. It sounds like you're the only one here. Alright. It still paid to be cautious. We run a light shop the day after Shell, and the other girls have the day off. Yendel grinned easily, and leaned over on the counter showing a bit of cleavage, but mostly she just looked relaxed. Unless there's something big, just one of us comes in to get orders out today. Gives us an extra day off most weeks. I'm surprised you had them done in just a week? Vadim nodded, hiding any trace of his nerves. He needed to learn to deal with women out on their own more easily. If he could face dating a princess, well, surely there would be things a lot harder than this. Yeah, you're barking. Yendel nodded. We got lucky. Turned out there's a whole video file on the datanet by some human cutie named Travis. Tells you exactly how to turn them out, along with a lot of other stuff if you have the need. Oh! Vadim felt his spirits perk up. Mr. Warwick was going to teach the girls how to use a sword of all things, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd been able to help. It was alright not being the one moving mountains, if you were there to support the woman that did. Is there a file? I mean, if they need something I haven't heard of, I could see what you can make? Sure thing. She nodded, tugging her omnipad out of her back pocket. We all took a look at it. It seems odd, but, you know, hitting each other with these things? You say these girls aren't training to be Marines? No, ma'am. Vadim shook his head. It wasn't like he could explain. It's just, for fun. Yeah? I don't know. You seem like a nice young guy. I have a lovely niece. Yadra's daughter works as a laser engraver, a real artist. Yendel grinned. Noble girls whacking away at each other with these things? Look, if you don't mind me giving you a little motherly advice, you should stay away from those nobles. They're touchy and difficult, and the higher they are, the worse it gets. I'll keep that in mind, Vadim nodded. He knew he was crazy about Melondi, but Melondi was also Princess Kalira. Life with her wouldn't be spent in the kitchen cooking dinner and waiting for her to come home from work. But if things went right, life would be something. Well, if she proposed. She had entanglements he couldn't even imagine. Who knew what the Empress would say? There were times he worried she'd break his heart. In the meantime, he just needed to hope for the best. Melondi poked through the library, watching Desi and Ziki. She was almost certain she was thinking it right. The name didn't roll off the tongue easily, but learning someone's name and remembering it were important skills at court. It would have to do, Desi was trying her best, but after they found the Pezin girl and convinced her to come along, she hadn't been much of a talker. At least the human exhibit seemed to pique her interest. Desi was struggling. For someone that social, that said a lot. It wasn't unheard of for there to be an alien in a family. Helcom got along particularly easily, but this girl was a Pezin. Aside from being an alliance race, she knew nothing about them. A few calls would fix that, given a little time. Thankfully, things improved when they reached the human exhibit. That put Desi in her element, and the Pezin girl obliged by losing her earlier reticence, asking questions about everything. Some of them were a bit unusual, but it was better than nothing. They reached the Asia section when Ziki stopped to stare at the weapons on display. Melondi looked at the case with mixed emotions. If those hadn't been there, she would have died. Zinshiki seemed enthralled.
There are times I fail to understand how humans are still alive, Zinshiki said after a moment. I'm sorry?
Desi had been doing her best as tour guide, but even that caught her off guard.
Everything I read to prepare for the lessons about this war, I do not understand why they are not all dead.
Zinshiki's tail flickered, as she nodded towards the case.
Pezin hunt for survival. I know I don't know you yet.
Desi was easing her way around the point, but Mel just listened as she worked it out.
Professor Pelavon told me about your, other family? That Pezin work as mercenaries? Pezin hunt in bands, and we never killed one another wholesale. We could not afford such damage to our world.
Zinshiki glanced over at them both, with those unnervingly bright green eyes. It seemed like she never blinked.
We don't do armies. The Alliance tried. So, you're telling me it's impossible to get Pezin to work together?
Desi kept her tone light, trying to keep Zinshiki talking.
I mean, my family has Marines in it. Almost any girl here has someone in the military. What's the problem?
Something caught Zinshiki's attention, and she wandered over for a better look. There was still nothing like an expression on her face, but her tail had gone stock still. Desi wandered over behind her, and Melondi followed suit. This was a lot easier than being faced with the ambassador of some new species at court, or even an old one.
It still says Rakiri was supposed to like carrion when they're sick. What is this thing?
Zinshiki gestured at one of the innumerable oddities in the cabinet, and leaned down to look at the placard.
This lucky cat. Professor Warwick was telling me about this. It's a sort of good luck charm.
Desi leaned down to look at the little golden figure with a waving arm.
How did it go there? I mean, it was, I do not wish to speak of it, she said flatly. Right. Professor Warwick is a very acceptable teacher.
Yes, we think he's great. Melondi exchanged looks with Desi, who was starting to look desperate. Melondi nodded back, ready to step in, when the Pezin girl abruptly sniffed at the statue and turned away.
I did not understand what he was saying today, however, or why he stalled at the beginning of his talk. He did not hesitate when teaching at Sochet.
Zinshiki turned to face them both, and Melondi schooled her features to act natural. At least Zinshiki was saying something they didn't know.
What was wrong with him?
He was upset about his home.
Melondi stepped forward. It wasn't fair to make Desi answer questions about the Imperium's arrival on Earth, though she made a quick note to find out how the Alliance landed on Zinshiki's world and what it was called.
Didn't you hear what he said?
Of course.
Zinshiki shrugged, though her gaze didn't change.
I understood he was upset, but I do not know why. His remark lacked context. I could smell the change in his scent. I do not know what they mean, but I believe he was in great distress. You'd know, I suppose,
Desi muttered. It was impolitic, and words like that would have caused problems at court, but she rallied.
I'm sorry, but you were hunting him. It's going to take me a while to get over that. He's going to be my father. I make no apologies, although I admit I was a cause for some distress.
Zinchiki might actually have arched an eyebrow dismissively. The girl was so expressionless that it felt like a tectonic plate shifting.
My lord performed well in spite of his fear. He is brave. I'm sorry, Desi frowned. Why are you calling him my lord?
Zinchiki actually cantered ahead of that, regarding Desi carefully.
The Shilvantia Soche made it clear they did not want to hear my language, much less learn of it. My lord is the closest translation to a Prof Haakak in Vatica. A Hak is a noble teacher. A Prof Haakak is more noble lord teacher who bestows their name, but that is a poor translation.
That was different, and Melondi leaped at the change of subject.
I don't mind learning. Do you, Desi?
No, I'm already learning English.
Desi took the hint and nodded along.
You're going to be my sister. Is that right? I mean, the right translation? It is acceptably close. I admit he did not like it when I called him that, but that does not change the nature of what is.
Zinchiki sounded definite on that point.
He is my haakak. One day his name will be mine, and until then I will look after him.
Look after him? Melondi blurted out. So much for loose lips at court. Still, it was a fair question, wasn't it? Women were supposed to take good care of the men in their families, but did that mean the same thing from Zinchiki?
He will teach me his ways, and in return I will ensure his name carries respect and has power. That is one of the 20 kahahakt of my people.
The tip of Zinchiki's tail flickered, and she blinked once or twice, before blowing out a little breath between her lips.
Besides, someone has to look after him. He seems to get in trouble, even if I do not understand him. I admit I do not know why he seems so upset, or how to work with something like that. I do not want to hurt him even more with the wrong words.
Melondi bit her lower lip and glanced over at Desi, who seemed visibly relieved. Zinchiki's heart seemed to be in the right place. A weird place, but at least it was understandable. Maybe changing the subject would do for now.
Do you think this war class is going to be that bad?
Zinchiki shrugged.
Shilvanti love the military, but you do not understand the cost of fighting.
Excuse me?
Melondi balked, and only a lifetime of training stopped her in time. Even so, pride had some limits. The Imperial military is the best in the galaxy.
Your people revere their fighters, but they do not understand the costs. After so many drugs, I wonder if your hunters do themselves. You sound like Professor Warwick.
Desi came to the rescue, thankfully.
I know that he has views, but we take care of our troops. Then perhaps he is making sense. Pezin fight personally, and we do not edit our memories when things get uncomfortable.
Zinchiki went back to looking at the lucky cat, and her eyes narrowed to slits.
It is no wonder my people are trying to figure them out.
What do you mean?
Desi asked carefully. Humans. They seem conflicted, but they fight well.
How do you know how humans fight? Desi frowned, her voice getting a bit tart.
I have been learning things from other war bands,
Zinchiki said nonchalantly, though it took her a moment. Alien or not, Melondi knew when someone was stalling. The look on her face was the first actual expression she'd given away, as she stared at the screen.
The Shilvanti need to give them back their ekritu, their victory runes, their hope symbols. It does not translate well, but it is their identity. As long as the Shilvanti insist on stripping humans of them, humans will resent the Empire.
Desi crossed her arms defiantly.
You say that like you know something. Perhaps. Possibly because the Empire is not trying to strip me of mine.
The tip of Shinshiki's tail did that double flip again. Melondi marked it down as a tell. Maybe.
It is content so long as Pezin pay our taxes and follow its rules. You did not do all of these things to the Helcom. The Imperium even relented with the Rakiri. Perhaps you punish the humans because they remind you too much of yourselves.
There was nothing good down this road, but Melondi felt herself almost splutter, wanting to defend her empire. Desi came to her rescue, pointing at the lucky cat.
Are you sure that doesn't remind you of something? It is a totem for luck. Hideous as it is, that gives it worth.
She shrugged nonchalantly. Zinshiki had that move down cold.
It will be preferable for humans to associate Pezin with good fortune.
Pride, then. Fine. She'd met any number of adult nobles who were stuffed with pride. Some were proud of the Empire, some were proud of their accomplishments, and some were just proud. Desi wasn't polished, but she'd managed to disguise herself as a noble for well over a year. Besides, she didn't suffer fools, and Professor Warwick must have had his reasons. Zinshiki was Desi's problem, if she was a problem. If so, well, then she'd be there for Desi. Goddess knew Desi had been there for her. Still, it wasn't like she could defend her family.
So, will you come help us plan his wedding? It's a surprise,
Melondi offered, dangling the change of subject as Desi nudged them over to the next area.
Here's my haakak. I will be there.
The pestering girl made it sound self-evident, but she had used her own language. If the people at Sochet had dismissed her that badly, well, maybe it was even an offering of trust. It was worth paying attention to. Zinshiki paused and blinked.
He does not do well with surprises. He gives them well, but I do not think he enjoys them. It's going to be so romantic, though. The whole school knows about it. I bet he does too. We just can't tell him that we know.
Desi shrugged.
Professor Pelavon told me that Professor Burgress is doing all kinds of research, and Professor Hameris is actually a priest. Am I meant to be surprised? Oh, you haven't heard about Professor Hameris?
Desi grinned, looking like she was back on better footing.
Trust me, you'll be surprised. I have been surprised by too many things of late, Zinshiki muttered. I trust there is not a pool involved? No, but goddess, they have the whole amphitheatre.
Desi grinned happily.
It's practically all water.
It's carved into a natural sea cave. I'm part of the choir and we give concerts there.
Melondi let the tension go out of her shoulders. There were times when it felt like she was carrying a whole ocean on her back, particularly now that someone was trying to kill her. But for the moment, she was Melondi, helping her friend talk about things that didn't involve life, death, wars, or empires.
The whole basin is filled with seawater and is fantastic at sunset. Waves roll in past the breakers and everything.
The girl's tail quivered, and she started to mutter,
Ekpu, rala gak nak.
Desi glanced back from where she was leading them.
What does that mean?
Zinshiki drew back her lips.
It means fine.
Lamana Davari shut down the video feed on her desk and closed her eyes in thought. Princess Kalira seemed safe. Although the Pezin girl would still need attention, this matter might simply remain a concern. If so, her giving the pods in the bunker conniptions was almost a bonus. Perhaps she might be useful as a standing drill, at least until Lieutenant Tala figured out how she spotted the security cameras. It was another flaw in the security, but one they would remedy, and she made a note to see how the ground pods did with tracking the girl. The commandos had enjoyed a full week off duty. It was time to make certain they were sharp. As for Warwick, she'd already read him his marching orders. For once, it would be good to see him jump. instead of feeling like she was one step behind. Whether he fully realized it or not, he appeared to have become a fatherly figure in the princess's life. Not entirely surprising given the fate of her father. She'd been sheltered after his death, but if she wasn't cut in the mold of the Empress or the late Princess Calandri, at least she hadn't become a useless dilettante, like Princess Camordri. This assignment was proving to have its challenges, but it hadn't been so bad. In the meantime, she finally had Warwick under some kind of control. To think that he'd been storing away illicit music. Judging from his conversation with the Pezin girl, it was prescribed material, at least on Earth. On Shill, that was another matter. There were no restive humans to stir into rebellion, no red zones where an errant lyric might be a code or call to arms. His native tongue was essentially gibberish to anyone but his students, and only the Deshin girl was actively learning it. No, it was prescribed, and perhaps it should be illegal, but outside the jurisdiction of the human system, it didn't even merit a fine. Warwick didn't need to know that.